Young boy once approached his father to ask, "Dad, why does the wind blow?" To which the father responded, "I don't know, son." "Dad, from where do the clouds come?" "I'm not sure, son." "Dad, what makes a rainbow?" "No idea, son." "Dad, do you mind me asking you all these questions?" "Not at all, son. How else are you ever going to learn?" Reformed Christians have been strong supporters of education and have invested heavily in educating their children, both in reading, writing, arithmetic, history, as well as in the ways of the Lord. Our Presbyterian tradition has had tremendous impact on the world as students enter into the workplace. Desert Palms Presbyterian Church, as we've celebrated earlier this morning, has been a wonderful example. For more than 2 decades, we have been partnering with students to various degrees through our scholarship program. Now, someone might ask, what does Christianity have to do with higher education? Well, the first traces of institutions which we could call schools of higher education can be found in history as far back as the 6th century before Christ was born. During the Dark Ages, the schools which became the parents of modern universities were born. Public schools were unknown. Priests gathered youngsters in the churches to teach them. And as these youngsters finished what we might term today the level called high school, the need arose for advanced education, especially for priests and lawyers and physicians. In Bologna, Italy, was established a university chiefly for the education of lawyers. In Salerno, Italy, a university chiefly for the education of physicians. In England, the church established Oxford and Cambridge. And when the European colonists came to this country, schools such as Harvard and Yale were established by the church primarily for the education of clergy. And as the churches pushed west, they founded universities such as Drake and Notre Dame and Southern Methodist. And at this point in history, the university movement had, with very few exceptions, been sponsored solely by the church. With the passage of the Morrill Act by the United States Congress in 1862, a new type of school of higher education was born in the United States, the state college. Since 1862, each state has founded at least one state college. And at the beginning of this movement, it was the church which furnished much of the leadership for those schools. Today, the picture has changed, however, as many of us know. Most state universities have at least 4 points in common. They have secular faculties. They are big. They place a strong emphasis on vocational education as well as broad general education. And by law, the principles by which they operate are purely secular. Now, personally, I'm proud of my alma mater, Grove City College, which is a Presbyterian school teaching the Christian faith and liberal arts. Now, this is all to say that Presbyterians cherish a full, well-rounded education for all people so that they can become all that God intends for them to be. And yes, times have changed, and sadly, our government and many institutions of higher education no longer support Christian beliefs, but we now find ourselves in a culture that is hostile to the God of the Bible. I mean, we have had pushes to remove the 10 Commandments and public prayer or anything to do with the Bible. So what is critical for followers of Jesus Christ is that we need to be aware of the times in which we are living. And so here's the fact. God speaks to us. God speaks to others, regardless of whether or not our culture is supportive of the divine truths. And so today I want to stress one aspect of learning, and that is that education requires that we listen in order to learn. And as Christians, we should listen for God speaking to us. And as human beings, we should respect one another enough to listen to each other. Over 80 years ago, Jed Harris was a successful producer of plays. One of his successful works was the production of Thornton Wilder's play, Our Town. And in the middle of a very lengthy season, mixed with the intense pressure of many details that had to be taken care of, Harris began to lose his sense of hearing. He could not even hear what other people close to him were saying, so he was missing crucial details during conversations. And as a result, Jed Harris decided to pay a visit to a renowned audiologist who listened attentively as the producer narrated the sad account of his declining ability to hear. And after a thorough examination of Harris's ears, the hearing specialist reached into the vest pocket and he pulled out an expensive gold-coated pocket watch and he placed it against Harris's ear. "Do you hear this watch ticking?" the audiologist asked. "Absolutely," Harris said. The audiologist then moved across the room to the door to his office. He held up the watch and he said, "Now focus. Do you hear it?" "Yes, it's quite audible." So the physician went into the next room. "How about now?" "Oh, it's still audible," Harris replied. So the specialist walked back into the office, returned the watch to his vest. "This phenomena is quite commonplace, especially among successful individuals," said the physician. "Your hearing is excellent, Mr. Harris. You've simply quit listening." In America today, so many people have stopped listening, and all that it has done is made people ignorant. The most successful people in the world today know what they believe and also know what others believe, and that can only happen if we listen to one another. Obviously, some people do have hearing problems. That happens, of course, especially later in life, and we're all aware of that fact, but not nearly as often as people missing learning opportunities simply because they choose not to listen to one another. I remember beginning seminary and being told by some of my friends that a particular professor had a point of view which many of my friends, and I probably even myself, I have to admit, would not agree. I remember that many students in the class always arguing with the professor, always standing up saying, "I'm right, you're wrong," but they never listened to the professor. I chose a different way. I read all the professor's books. I read the articles that he put in the library and read those so that when in class, the professor didn't know if I agreed with him or not. I could see all sides of a particular issue. Robert Holden, in his book Happiness Now, tells about how a husband and wife, both in their late 70s, who decided after 55 years of marriage to divorce. And when their counselor asked them why, the wife issued a catalog of reasons. "He never asked me if I'm happy," said the wife. "I just assumed you were," said the husband. "He never says he loves me." "I thought you knew that I loved you." The wife, "He never says I'm beautiful." "I look at you every day and admire your beauty." "We rarely talk," said the wife. "I know. I thought you liked to read a lot." "I read because we don't talk," said the wife. There was a pause. "And we never go out." "I thought you liked to stay in," said the husband. "I only stay in because I'm waiting to go out," said the wife. And the counselor continued to take notes. "And he's also very mean to me." "In what way?" asked the counselor. "Well, at breakfast 3 times a week for 55 years, he always serves me the crust of the loaf, and I hate bread crust." The husband was distraught. "I give you the crust, my dear, because that's my favorite part of the loaf." See, what we have here is that classic line, a failure to communicate. Communication is so vital to successful living and learning. Women, and my wife is right on this, because she's going to tell me later today, you never listen. But women seem to be more conscious of this than men. One national magazine polled over 30,000 women, and only one problem ranked above conflicts over money: poor communication. Researcher Terry Schultz writes, although many women chose their partners based on sex appeal, research shows that if they had to do it again, they said the ability to communicate is much more important. And so there's this beautiful story in the Bible about someone who spent a lifetime listening. And in his case, though, he was listening to God. Most of you remember the story, the boy Samuel from your Sunday school days. It begins with a very touching scene of a holy woman by the name of Hannah pleading with God to allow her to bear a son because she's barren. Hannah made a vow to God that if he would allow her to bear a son, that she would give the boy to the service of God all the days of his life. And some time passed, and God answered Hannah's prayer. She conceived, she bore a son, calling his name Samuel, which actually means name of God. Hannah followed through on her promise to give Samuel to God, and as soon as he was weaned, Samuel was placed under the care and training of an old priest named Eli. He was to learn from Eli. Eli was gradually losing his vision, but he was faithful in his teaching of young Samuel. And he also gave Samuel some light duties around the tabernacle. Now, when he was about 11, this incident that we read moments ago, hearing his name and going to Eli's bedside, appeared. And I want to stress one part of what Eli said. When Eli finally realized that it was the Lord speaking, he says to Samuel, "If he calls you again, say, 'Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening.'" And so Samuel laid down. When he heard his name again, Samuel actually said, "Speak, for your servant is listening." It's a beautiful story about the call of one of Israel's greatest prophets of God. God spoke, Samuel listened. And notice the 19th verse. The Lord was with Samuel as he grew up, and he let none of Samuel's words fall to the ground. Now that's weird. In other words, Samuel, who listened to God, had a lifelong relationship with God and a fruitful ministry. Wonderful things happen when we're willing to listen. So please note, listening is not the same as hearing. Hearing refers to the sounds that enter into our ears. It is a physical process that, provided you do not have any hearing problems, happens automatically. Listening, however, requires more than that. It requires focus and concentrated effort, because that's how we learn. An 80-year-old grandfather went to his daughter's house for Sunday dinner, and when the meal was over, he announced that he was going to take a walk, maybe for 20 minutes or so. When 2 hours had passed, he finally returned, and he said, "Sorry I'm late, but I stopped to talk to an old friend, and he just wouldn't stop listening." Now, I like that. There's a lot of people that won't stop talking, but blessed is the person who doesn't stop listening. It's a wonderful gift to give someone, to listen to them that intently. The greatest respect that you can offer a teacher, a professor, another person, or even someone whose views are different than yours is to really listen. As David Augsburger once said, an open ear is the only believable sign of an open heart. Listening is not the same as hearing. Listening requires intent. It requires focus. One common problem is that instead of listening closely to what someone is saying, we often get distracted, do we not? They speak a sentence or two, and now we're already focused on what our response is going to be, rather than listening. You can see how dangerous that can be. Listening is so important that many top employers provide listening skills training for their employees. This is not surprising when you consider that good listening skills can lead to better customer satisfaction, greater productivity with fewer mistakes, and increased sharing of information. That in turn can lead to more creative and innovative workplace experiences. But I think we can all agree, hearing is not the same thing as listening. Listening to someone is a way of saying, "You are important to me, you really matter." Author and radio teacher Chuck Swindoll once found himself in too many commitments in too few days. And in his book, you may have read it, Stress Fractures, he tells about getting nervous and tense about all he had to do. "I was snapping at my wife and our children, choking down my food at mealtimes, feeling irritated, and thus unexpected interruptions messed up my day. Before long, things around our home started reflecting the pattern of my hurry-up style, and it was becoming unbearable. I distinctly remember after supper one evening the words of our younger daughter, Crelin. She wanted to tell me something important and what had happened to her at school that day, and she began hurriedly, 'Daddy, I want to tell you something. I want to tell you really fast.' And suddenly realizing her frustration, Swindoll answered, 'Honey, you can tell me. You don't have to tell me really fast. Say it slowly.' And he says, I'll never forget her answer. She said, then listen slowly. What she wanted to know was if her daddy cared enough about her to really listen. And that's what many people are hungering for. When we listen to them, really listen, we are saying, you matter to me. Of course, the one to whom we must listen the most is God. Nancy Ortberg tells of going to dinner with a man by the name of Doug Cole in Washington, D.C. Doug, in the conversation, told her about a 30-year-old insurance executive that he met at a party. Doug learned that this young man, Bob, was a new Christian. Doug was a very mature Christian. Intrigued, Doug asked Bob how things were going now that he was in D.C. Have you found a church? Oh, yes, we found a church. Have you found a Bible study to get into? Yes, I participated in a Bible study. And finally, Doug asked, how about your relationship with God in prayer? Bob didn't have much going on there and said he didn't know much about prayer. Didn't even know if it worked. So Doug laid out a challenge for Bob to pick something to pray over every day for the next 6 months. It was a challenge. The prayers could be elaborate or simple, structured or free form, listening to or speaking to God, whatever. But Bob must pray at least briefly every day for one particular topic. And here was the challenge. Doug told him that if at the end of 6 months, if he had prayed every day for that one topic, and God had not done something truly significant on account of those prayers, Doug would pay Bob $500. Huh, Nancy looked at Doug and said, that doesn't sound very biblical. No, it's not biblical at all, but I do it all the time, Doug answered. So Bob accepted the challenge, but didn't know for what to pray. Bob and his wife, living in D.C., had decided at one point, with all the international flavor of D.C., that they would choose a different land to pray for every day. So along those lines, Bob decided to pray daily for 6 months for Kenya. Not much happened for 4 or 5 months. In fact, very little happened. Then one night, Bob was at a dinner party and was sitting next to a woman, and she was from Kenya. She ran an orphanage. Bob related that he felt as though ice water was suddenly running through his veins because up until now, he had been fantasizing how he was going to spend that $500 that Doug was going to pay him. But suddenly he had a strong vision of a wad of $500 sprouting wings and flying away. He asked for details about the orphanage, listened to this woman's answers for a full, intense hour. And then she looked at Bob and said, no one in the United States has ever shown the interest that you have shown in my orphanage in Kenya. Would he be willing to consider flying to Kenya to see it firsthand? To make a long story short, Bob ended up providing for the care of those Kenyan children and seeing to the supplying of that orphanage. He made such a splash that the president of Kenya invited him to his palace. Once there, Bob advocated for prisoners of conscience in Kenya. Later, those prisoners, in about 2 weeks, were released. The United States Secretary of State called Bob and asked him how he did it. He said to Bob that the United States government had been unsuccessfully seeking their freedom for quite some time. It was no mystery to Bob how it came about. God had guided him to pray for Kenya, and wonderful things were happening. If you and I were truly listening to God, to one another, we would see wonderful things happen in our lives too. Hearing isn't the same as listening, and I have to admit that to my wife. She tells me that every day. When we listen to someone, we are saying, you are really important to me. You matter. And the most important listening that we can do is to listen to God. Because God's deepest wish is to direct us to a positive and fulfilling life. If that's not happening in our lives, it's because we're not listening to God. Remember what Paul said, faith comes from hearing and hearing through the word of Christ. Notice he didn't say that faith comes from talking or from doing. Faith comes from hearing, and that only happens when we listen. The old prophet Eli told Samuel, go and lie down, and if he calls you, say, speak, Lord, for your servant is listening. So Samuel went and lay down in his place. And the Lord came and stood there, calling as the other time, Samuel, Samuel. And then Samuel said, speak. for your servant is listening. What an eloquent and yet powerful act. Are you listening to the people around you, especially those closest to you? And most importantly, are you listening to God? A positive, fulfilling life awaits you. Just listen. Amen.